The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always an honour to rise in this House as an elected member representing the people of Timmins James Bay. When you're an elected member, you're accountable to the people who vote for you. You go back every 2 years. I've gone back once, 18 months, 2 years, 4 years. It's a job interview. And if the people decide that they don't like your record, they vote you out. That's what democracy is. So here tonight in the Democratic House, we're talking about people who have no democratic mandate, people who believe themselves to be superior to the people of Canada, a group who feel themselves completely, they show such outrage over questions of accountability because they've never had to show accountability to anyone except their political masters, the leaders of the Liberal and Conservative parties who appoint them. So this motion that we're debating tonight, Mr. Speaker, comes on the eve of the most explosive political scandal with the Senate in Canadian history, and certainly one of the great political scandals, because this is not just about the abuse of public trust. This is not just about fraud. This is about people who actually may constitutionally not even be allowed to sit in that upper chamber, and yet they have the right, under this present system, to overrule the democratically elected voices of the people of Canada. We saw that, Mr. Speaker, when Pamela Wallin helped galvanize her cronies to defeat Jack Layton's climate change bill. Pamela Wallin at that time was sitting on the boards of all manner of corporations, including tar sands development corporate interests. And that was considered okay, that she could take her role as a senator and also receive a financial interest for doing tar sands development and yet kill a climate change bill that was voted on with the support of the people of this country. So the issues of how we're going to deal with this unelected, non-accountable Senate, they are something that this House needs to deal with, and it's fascinating, Mr. Speaker, to watch the behaviour of the other two old parties. Now, the Liberals have long been, they were born as the party of cronyism and corruption. That is their baby in the upper chamber. It's not a surprise that so many Liberal senators are up to their necks in this scandal, because this was how the Liberal machine was done. It was the system of cronyism. It was a system of patronage. It was a system of the old boys club. If you flip pancakes at Liberal fundraisers, you just someday might end up in the Senate, and then you could travel around the world. You could do whatever you want. You'll never have to be checked. So I'm not surprised at the Liberal intransigence and their deep, deep desire to defend the Senate. But certainly, Mr. Speaker, from having been elected here in 2004, watching the behaviour of the Conservatives, well, that's something to see. I remember a different Conservative party, a Reform party, that believed that the cronies in the upper chamber were an abomination to Canadians, and who sold themselves in Western Canada that they were going to bring accountability, but they never did. Instead of bringing accountability, they brought us Patrick Brazo. They brought us Mike Duffy. They brought us Pamela Wallin. They brought us Carolyn Stewart-Olson. They brought us the rest of that crew. And now you see them, Mr. Speaker, doing whatever they can to change the channel on the endemic corruption that's in that institution. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I said at the outset, this is not, I mean, I could do a long litany of Senate abuse going back through the ages of Senator Andy Thompson, who lived in Mexico and collected a paycheck and showed up in Canada maybe once a year. And that went on year after year. And we were told that back and then, well, he's a senator, he can't be touched. I could talk about Raymond Levine, the Liberal senator who was convicted of fraud and was sent off to the Huskow. And all the manner of red flags that were raised by the RCMP at the time of his incarceration, which the Senate ignored. I could talk about all numerous failed candidates and party organizers and bagmen over the years that have been dumped in that upper chamber, where for the rest of their lives, taxpayers paid them to work for the parties. Yeah. But I think, Mr. Speaker, let's just focus on how we came to this present corruption scandal, because the Conservatives are doing everything they can to change the channel on how we got there. And this is why this debate tonight is so important, because it begins with the notorious three of Wallin, Brazeau, and Duffy, and the appointment by the Prime Minister December 28th, 29th, 2008 to appoint the three of them. And at that time, questions were immediately raised that Senator Pamela Wallin and Senator Mike Duffy were not eligible to actually sit in the Senate. In fact, at the time when the media asked, and they said, how can Mike Duffy be a senator from Prince Edward Island? Everyone knows he lives in Canada. And Dimitri Soudas told the media, all our nominees will meet their residency requirements. This was the beginning. This was the original sin that led us to where we are tonight. That people who were not eligible to sit in the Senate were appointed to the Senate. Why? Because they were going to do the heavy lifting for the Conservative machinery in terms of the fundraising. That was Duffy's role. That was Wallin's role. That was even Patrick Brazeau's role. And there were flags raised because Pamela Wallin did not live in Wadena, Saskatchewan. She lived in a condo in Toronto. And Section 30 of the Constitution is clear that a senator will be disqualified to sit if, quote, they cease to be qualified in respect of property. Now, what's been attempted to be claimed by the Conservatives that it's owning $4,000 worth of property will make you eligible to sit in the Senate, but that's not what the Constitution says. It says the senators shall be resident in the province for which they represent. And so the Prime Minister knew that they were not qualified to sit in the Senate. And this is the beginning of all the issues with Mike Duffy. And we've seen numerous prevarications from my colleagues, particularly the member for Markham Oak Ridge, who said that the rules have been clear for 150 years, but then won't explain what the rules are. But if you look at the RCMP investigation into the Mike Duffy affair, it keeps coming back to the fact that Mike Duffy was well aware that he actually wasn't eligible to sit in the Senate. And he wanted that issue dealt with. And he was told, well, don't worry, nobody's ever been thrown out of the Senate. Well, it's true, because it's an old boys club. It's like being a made man. Once you're in the Senate, they look after you. But Duffy was aware of that issue. So the issues were raised in numerous. February 15th, Nigel Wright writes to Benjamin Parham, quote, I am gravely concerned that Senator Duffy would be considered a resident of Ontario. Possibly then Senator Patterson in BC too. Well, wait a minute, isn't Senator Patterson supposed to represent Nunavut? If this were adopted as the Senate's view about whether constitutional qualifications were met, the consequences are obvious. So Nigel Wright is writing to the Prime Minister's lawyer on February 15th that if the word gets out that Duffy's not eligible to sit, then what about their other senators? So constitutionally, the questions they knew was that they were not even eligible to sit. And what that sitting gave them the power was to override a democratically elected House. And then so the Prime Minister's office pressures the Senate Rules Committee to remove the definition, to protect the caucus, and to secure Duffy's own repayment of expenses. They say, we'll cut the check for Duffy, and then everything, it says, quote, if that's all that stands in the way of Senator Duffy paying back his $32,000 and closing out the situation, but Duffy didn't owe $32,000, he owed $90,000. Nigel Wright says, quote, if the Rules and Procedure Committee doesn't have the right membership, then the Senate by motion could constitute a special committee that will have the right senators on board. We cannot rely on the Senate leader's office to get this right. Have to do this in a way that does not lead to the Chinese water torture of new facts in the public domain that the Prime Minister doesn't want. So the Prime Minister's right hand is saying, we can't trust the Senate to get this right, to protect us, to cover up. We're going to have to make sure, to defend the Prime Minister, that we will, through the Prime Minister's office, start appointing people to handle the audit. So, Mr. Speaker, what does that have to do with tonight? Well, this has to do with the fact that, according to the RCMP, key senators in the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister's staff were recognizing that they had to come up with a scam to cover up the fact that Duffy was ineligible to sit in the Senate, and it would lead to whitewashing the audit. Nigel Wright then says, quote, I will advise Senator LeBreton that we will not take any steps in the Senate to address residency unless anyone challenges the qualification of any of our senators, in which case we will defend and defeat any motion regarding, of course, because they have the majority, any senator who owns property in the correct province. I will advise Senator Duffy that we will defeat any challenge to the residency purposes and advise them to settle the expenses matter promptly. So they're telling Duffy we'll deal with the residency thing, we'll get this money paid back. Right then says, I think we should lay out the approach in a brief memo to the Prime Minister, because getting confirmation of qualification residency is all that's needed to close out the Duffy situation. So they've got the scheme, they've got the plan, they're going to appoint the people to the Senate board that's dealing with the audit. They just need to get the sign-off on the Prime Minister, and what they're getting him to sign off on is to say that Duffy's a resident, which everyone knew he wasn't. So February 20th, Nigel Wright sends an email to Chris Woodcock, Benjamin Parham, and other PMO staff. I have again spoken to Senator Duffy. Tomorrow I shall receive by courier redacted copies of his diaries and other info to back up his claim to have PEI as opposed to his home in Cavendish as his primary residence. Our team will look to see if there's anything in that we do not want his lawyer to send to the Senate Steering Committee. Maybe it will persuade him to take his chances with Deloitte's findings. If not, I have told him I will be back on his case about repayment. So they're already planning what they're going to share with the audit committee. And then they approach Tkachuk, Senator Tkachuk, they approach LeBreton, and they're talking about whitewashing an audit into potential fraud. This is the Prime Minister of the country of Canada and his staff cooking up a scheme to whitewash an audit into fraud. And it said, Nigel Wright, so this is the deal. It was their 5-point deal. This was the big issue that held up the deal. That he, Duffy, will repay with a couple of conditions, including that admitting to a primary residence in Ottawa does not qualify him from representing Prince Edward Island in the Senate. They're just making the Constitution up. That's part of the deal. But Nigel Wright said, I have been specific with Duffy that a senior government source, quote, senior government source, will make a statement on the day of his statement to the effect that there is no doubt he's qualified to sit as a senator. The PMO will also give this answer if he is asked, as will other authorized people for the government. So, in the deal, he has to go. He talks to Benjamin Parham. He says, I got to go to the Prime Minister. I got to run this deal by him. Then he comes back and says, good to go. And then the Prime Minister of Canada stands up in this House and repeats verbatim what was in the plan to get Mike Duffy off the hook, which is that Mike Duffy, a man who lives in Canada, Ontario, somehow qualifies to be in the Senate representing Prince Edward Island. And they thought they were going to get away with this. But, Mr. Speaker, questions continued to be asked. And then, once the RCMP became involved, we began to see that there was actually an attempt to whitewash the audit, to interfere with the Deloitte audit. So, are Canadians, Mr. Speaker, to trust the Senate on this latest scandal? Are they going to trust the Prime Minister? Hardly. So we now have the Auditor General's report brought in. And so at the side right now, LeBreton, Tkachuk, Stuart Olson, who've been disgraced for having been involved in this scheme. But they're still all in the Senate. They can't be fired. So who replaces them? Leah Housakos, the Prime Minister's Montreal bagman, who's appointed to the Senate, suddenly is appointed by the Prime Minister as the Speaker in the House. Senator James Cowan, the Liberal leader, and Senator Carignan, who received letters that they have spending problems, and they step forward to the Senate, and they tell the senators, we'll set up a process to deal with this. Now, Mr. Speaker, when the Auditor General comes up with findings, that is the process. We're in this crazy alternate universe that the Senate and the Conservative Party have created, that the Auditor General, it's just his opinion. We actually have to set up another process. I've never heard of the Auditor General coming in and investigating any department and being told, well, that's just the Auditor General's opinion. We're actually, within our department, where they found all these problems, we're going to set up another internal process run by our own department to show that the Auditor General's wrong. But that's what the Senate claims they're going to do. So who is going to run that? Leah Housakos, James Cowan, Mr. Carignan, who step in and announce that they will set up this other process, that they will oversee, at a time when they knew that they were under investigation. Now, ask the Canadian people if that has any credibility, any reason for them to trust with the pattern that we've seen of abuse of public trust here. And, Mr. Speaker, we still have not dealt with the fact, out of the ITO, that there are a number of senators in there who are not living in places where they actually claim to represent, may not even be eligible. So on May 15th, 2015, the Senate invokes privilege to keep secret a document about whether senators are even eligible to sit in the upper chamber. This is a complete abuse of the Canadian people, and they get away with it, Mr. Speaker, because they don't believe that they're accountable to the Canadian people. That's unacceptable. It's unacceptable that a democratically elected House is told there's nothing you can do about this gang because whatever they decide is their own ticket. So we're in a situation where the Auditor General has brought a report out that was immediately leaked in all manner of areas by the senators under investigation. So they give themselves 4 or 5 days of damage control to undermine the Auditor General of this country. And James Cowan, the Liberal leader in the Senate, comes out and starts attacking the work of the Auditor General while saying that he's the man who's going to make sure that this process is trustworthy. Canadians have no faith in that, Mr. Speaker. Canadians are fed up. They have dealt with this institution for too long. They've been told that there's nothing we can do about them, that they can write their own ticket, that they can do whatever they want, that if it's like the honor system in there. And what I'm seeing from my colleagues in the Conservative Party is absolutely no leadership whatsoever on tackling this. This is the great scandal of our generation. But they've gone to ground because the scandal continues to go back, Mr. Speaker, to the Prime Minister's office. It's in the RCMP-ITO. The cover-up, the naming of senators who were not eligible, the fact that they had decided that they couldn't trust the Senate themselves to do the cover-up for the Prime Minister, that the Prime Minister's office would actually start to choose who was going to be on the committee. Caroline Stewart-Olson, appointed to the Senate. What's her qualifications? Oh, she was a communications flack for the Prime Minister. She's put in on the board to oversee this. The Prime Minister puts all his key people in. So this is no longer a government that has anything to do with the legacy of Preston Manning and the promise of reform, and that we were going to deal with the Senate and we were going to look for alternatives that could have the trust of the Canadian people. This is now a government in absolute damage control. They are mirrored. They're locked in step with the corruption in the Senate because this has become something that the Prime Minister has decided that he can get better deals by appointing people who are not eligible to sit in the Senate to do party work, something that he railed against in opposition, Mr. Speaker. But right now, this is the Conservative plan. So they don't want to deal with this. So what they're going to do is they're going to try and ride this out. But I don't think it's possible anymore. So we're being told again and again, here we are in 2015, that the Canadian people have no ability. We're just still the little peons, that we have no ability to stand up to this culture of entitlement. Well, tonight we actually have an opportunity. We can say, no, sorry, enough's enough. You want to continue sitting in there? We're going to cut off the taps, and then we're going to start talking. We're going to talk about establishing a clear set of rules for a non-elected, non-accountable group. I would like to see them gone tomorrow. But in the meantime, I'd like to see the clear ethical standards that we would set in place with them, so that unlike Mike Duffy, where we see his diary full of lobbying and potential illegal lobbying, that is not his business. His business should be reviewing legislation. They shouldn't be traveling around the country doing this. Mr. Speaker, I would like to end on a quote. Obviously, the government thinks it's being clever by appointing men and women, but the real concern is whether it's women or men or French or English or whatever, these people inevitably don't represent anybody but the Prime Minister who appoints them. We don't think a party that patronage has any place in the Parliament of Canada. I would like to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never agreed with the Prime Minister of this country before, but I certainly agree with his sentiments when he said that in 1995. I want to say, what happened to that Prime Minister? Why did he lose his way? And why did he lead Canadians directly into the corruption scandal that we're in today because of his desire to hang out with the Senate?